There are some stories that survive for centuries because they are not just stories. They are mirrors. They show us fear, faith, weakness, courage, and the strange way history can change in a single moment. And among all the ancient stories ever told, few are as powerful as this one. It is the story of a battlefield covered in dust. The story of a giant no one dared to face. The story of an army frozen by fear. And the story of a young shepherd boy who walked into that fear with nothing but a sling, 5 stones, and a heart that refused to bow. This is not just the story of David and Goliath. This is the complete story of how one impossible moment changed the fate of a nation. So sit back and step with me into the valley of Elah. Because this is where fear stood tall, and faith stood taller. Long before David ever faced a giant, he was just a boy from Bethlehem. He was not a prince. He was not a general. He was not even the strongest man in his own family. He was the youngest son of Jesse, a shepherd's son in a house full of older brothers. The kind of boy most people overlooked. The kind of boy who was often sent to do the quiet work that nobody else wanted to do. Bible Gateway Britannica. And that quiet work was the life of a shepherd. Now to some, that may sound peaceful. A boy with sheep under an open sky, green hills, gentle wind, silence. But shepherding was not soft work. It was lonely work, dangerous work, patient work. It meant long days under the sun, cold nights under the stars, and constant watchfulness. Because sheep are helpless, and the wilderness is not kind. David knew what it meant to stand alone when danger came creeping in. He knew what it meant to hear a strange movement in the dark and realize something was hunting the flock. He knew what it meant to act fast, not because he wanted glory, but because something weak had been placed in his care. And somewhere out in those lonely fields, David became more than a shepherd. He became brave when nobody was watching. He fought off wild animals, lions and bears, not in front of crowds, not with applause, not with music playing behind him, but alone, with only God as his witness. Those private battles would prepare him for a public one that would echo through history. Bible Gateway. At the time, the land of Israel was under the rule of King Saul, the first king of the nation. Saul looked like a king. He stood tall. He had authority. He had armor. He had an army. But appearances can be deceiving, because while Saul had the outer image of strength, the kingdom itself was walking into a season of fear. Britannica. Israel's old enemies, the Philistines, were rising again, and they came ready for war. The Philistines gathered their forces in a place called the Valley of Elah. Across from them stood the army of Israel. 2 nations, 2 hillsides, 1 valley between them. The air must have been heavy with tension. Every sunrise brought the possibility of bloodshed. Every night ended with uncertainty. But before the full battle began, the Philistines sent out something far worse than an army. They sent out a symbol of terror. His name was Goliath. He came from Gath, and he was not merely a soldier, he was a champion, a warrior chosen to represent the entire strength of the Philistine army. Ancient accounts describe him as a giant of extraordinary size, wrapped in bronze armor, carrying weapons so massive they sounded more like the gear of a machine and the equipment of a man. His armor alone weighed heavily. The iron point of his spear was enormous. Even the shaft of that spear was compared to a weaver's beam. Everything about him was meant to send one message: Bible Gateway Britannica. And Goliath knew exactly how to use fear. He walked out into the open and shouted toward Israel's camp. He did not ask for a full battle. He proposed something more personal, more humiliating, more psychological. "Send 1 man," he said, "1 man to fight me. If your man defeats me, we will serve you. But if I defeat him, you will serve us." It was a challenge, but more than that, it was warfare of the mind. because Goliath did not just want to beat Israel. He wanted to break Israel before the battle even started. And every morning and every evening, for 40 long days, he came out and did it again. Same valley, same mockery, same thunder in his voice, same poison in his words. 40 days, imagine that. 40 mornings, waking up with dread. 40 evenings, going to sleep with shame. 40 days, hearing a giant mock your people, your king, your God, and doing nothing. The soldiers of Israel were armed, but they were paralyzed. King Saul himself was terrified. The man who should have stepped forward first, the man whose size and title should have made him the natural champion, stood back in fear with everyone else. And when fear lives at the top, it spreads downward fast. Now while all this was happening, David was not even there. He was back in Bethlehem. His 3 oldest brothers had gone to fight in Saul's army. David moved back and forth, tending sheep and serving his family while the war dragged on. To the soldiers on the battlefield, he was just a boy, somewhere far away. To history, he was a name not yet spoken. Bible Gateway. Then one day, Jesse called David and gave him a simple task. Take food to your brothers. Carry grain and bread to the camp. Bring back news of how they are doing. That was it. No prophecy in the instructions. No dramatic music. No announcement that destiny was calling. Just an ordinary errand. And that is one of the most beautiful truths in this story. Sometimes, the road to your greatest moment begins with a task that feels painfully small. So David obeyed. He rose early in the morning, left the sheep with another keeper, took the supplies, and headed toward the battlefield. As he approached the camp, the sounds of war grew louder. Men shouting, boots moving, weapons clattering, banners rising in the wind. He found the baggage area, left what he had brought, and ran toward the battle line to greet his brothers. And as he stood there talking with them, it happened. Goliath stepped forward again. His usual challenge rolled across the valley like thunder. His words were full of defiance, mockery, contempt. He insulted Israel. He insulted their courage. And most of all, he insulted the God they claimed to serve. Bible Gateway. David heard him, and everything changed. Now the strange thing is this. The soldiers who had heard Goliath for 40 days only heard danger, but David heard dishonor. The men around him saw size. David saw arrogance. They saw a warrior too big to fight. David saw a blaspheming enemy too bold to ignore. He started asking questions. Who is this man? What will be done for the one who defeats him? Why is no one answering him? And the soldiers told him about the reward. The king had promised wealth. The king had even promised his daughter in marriage and freedom from taxes for the victor's family. But David was not truly moved by rewards. What shook him was deeper than that. How could this giant stand there and curse the armies of the living God, while an entire nation trembled? That question came from a different spirit. Not pride, not recklessness, conviction. But not everybody saw it that way. David's oldest brother, Eliab, heard him speaking and became angry. Very angry. Maybe he was embarrassed. Maybe he felt exposed. Maybe hearing his younger brother speak boldly made his own fear feel even heavier. So Eliab lashed out. Why are you here? Who did you leave those few sheep with in the wilderness? I know your pride, he said. You came down just to watch the battle. It was a cruel response. And if we are honest, many of the people who speak most sharply to courage are not always protecting wisdom. Sometimes they are protecting their own fear. But David did not let the accusation bury him. He answered calmly, almost with hurt in his voice. What have I done now? Can't I even ask a question? Then he turned away and kept speaking to others. That is another lesson hidden in this story. If David had stopped at Eliab's anger, history may have gone a different way. Sometimes destiny requires the strength to keep going, even when misunderstanding comes from your own family. Bible Gateway. Word began to spread through the camp. There is a young man asking about the giant. There is a shepherd boy speaking as if Goliath can be defeated. There is someone here who is not afraid. Eventually those words reached Saul, and David was brought before the king. Now imagine that moment. On one side, Saul, the ruler of Israel, dressed in royal authority, but inwardly shaken. On the other side, David, young and untested in war, still carrying the simplicity of the fields. And David said something remarkable. "Do not let anyone lose heart because of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul looked at him and saw what everyone else saw: youth, inexperience, smallness. He basically told David, "You cannot do this. You are just a boy, and this man has been a warrior from his youth." It was a reasonable objection. By military logic, Saul was right. But David was standing on a different kind of memory. He told Saul about the sheep, about the lion, about the bear, about the moments when a predator came, took a lamb, and ran, and how he had chased it, struck it, rescued the sheep, and if the beast rose against him, he seized it and killed it. These were not boasts, they were testimonies. David was saying, "I have already learned something out there in the hidden places. I have learned that when I stand for what has been entrusted to me, God does not abandon me. The God who rescued me from the lion and the bear," he said, "will rescue me from this Philistine too." At that point, Saul had little to lose. Fear had already humiliated the army for 40 days, so he agreed. "Go," he said, "and may the Lord be with you." Then Saul did something very human. He tried to dress David in his own armor. He put a tunic on him, a bronze helmet on his head, a coat of armor around him. David fastened the sword over it and tried to walk. But he couldn't. It did not fit him, not just physically, but spiritually. David had not been trained in royal armor. He had not built his confidence in iron and bronze. To wear Saul's armor would have been to enter the battle pretending to be someone else. And David refused. He took it off and chose instead what felt familiar: his staff, his shepherd's bag, his sling, and 5 smooth stones from a nearby stream. That moment matters more than many people realize. Because before David ever defeated Goliath, he first rejected imitation. He did not need to become Saul to win. He did not need to become Goliath to win. He only needed to be the man God had shaped in secret. So there he was, a shepherd boy walking down into the valley. No armor, no sword, no shield bearer. Just a sling in his hand, and a faith that looked foolish to everyone except heaven. Across the valley, Goliath saw him coming. At first, perhaps he could not believe what he was seeing. This was Israel's answer. This was the champion they had chosen. A boy. The giant moved forward, insulted, almost amused. Ancient descriptions say he despised David for his youth and appearance. To Goliath, this was not combat. Bible gateway. He cursed David by his gods. He mocked him. "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" he demanded. Then he made a promise, dripping with cruelty. "Come here," he said, "and I'll feed your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." And for a moment, all heaven and earth must have seemed to pause, because the giant had spoken. Now it was David's turn, and David did not answer with trembling. He answered with truth. "You come against me with sword, spear, and javelin," he declared, "but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." Listen to the courage in that. David was not denying Goliath's weapons. He was redefining reality. Yes, you have armor. Yes, you have strength. Yes, you have reach and training and terror on your side. But I do not stand alone. David went further. He said this day the Lord would hand Goliath over, and the whole world would know there is a God in Israel. He said everyone gathered there would learn that victory does not come by sword or spear, because the battle belongs to the Lord. Bible gateway. That was not empty confidence. That was faith speaking from history. not the history of nations, the history of his own life. The God who had carried him through loneliness, the God who had strengthened his arms in the dark, the God who had been faithful when nobody else saw him, would be faithful again. Then Goliath started moving in. Maybe he expected David to freeze. Maybe he expected him to drop the sling and run. But David did something shocking. He ran toward the battle. Not away from it, toward it. He reached into his bag, took out one stone, placed it in the sling, and began to whirl it. Now people often romanticize this moment, but remember, a sling in skilled hands was not a child's toy. It was a serious weapon. Fast, precise, deadly at a distance. What looked weak to Goliath was actually something he had not prepared for. David was not fighting on the giant's terms. He was fighting on his own. Bible Gateway. The stone flew, just one stone, across open air, through all the tension of 40 days, through every insult, through every fear, through every reason people had given for why this could never happen. And it struck Goliath in the forehead. The giant staggered. This mountain of a man, this symbol of terror, this walking fortress of bronze and threat, fell face down to the ground. The valley that had echoed with fear was suddenly silent. For a second, no one moved. It must have felt unreal. The impossible had just happened. But David was not finished. He had no sword of his own, so he ran forward, stood over Goliath, drew the giant's own sword from its sheath, and with it made the victory unmistakably final. Bible Gateway. And just like that, the spell of fear was broken. When the Philistines saw their champion fall, their confidence collapsed. The army that had hidden behind one giant lost heart. And the Israelites, who had been cowering for days, suddenly found their courage and surged forward with a shout. That is the strange thing about fear. It can hold thousands captive, until one person breaks it. Israel chased the Philistines down the road to Gath and Ekron. The enemy fled, their camp was plundered. The valley that had begun as a place of humiliation became the birthplace of victory. Bible Gateway, Britannica. But even after the battle, the story was not merely about military triumph. It was about identity. Saul looked at David and asked a question that reveals how little the world sometimes understands the people God is preparing in secret. Whose son is this young man? Abner, the commander, did not know. So David was brought before Saul, still carrying the evidence of victory, and answered simply, I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem. Bible Gateway. That answer matters. David could have introduced himself by his accomplishment. He could have defined himself by the giant he had just defeated. Instead, he answered with humility, I am Jesse's son. Because true greatness does not need to scream. And from that day forward, David's life would never be the same. The boy from the fields became known throughout Israel. His victory over Goliath gave him public renown, and in time he would rise as a warrior and leader of extraordinary influence. But that rise would also stir jealousy in Saul and open the next difficult chapters of David's life. This valley victory was not the end of David's story. Britannica. Now when many people hear this story, they reduce it to a slogan. Face your giants. Believe in yourself. Small can beat big. And yes, those ideas are there, but the complete story is deeper. David did not win because he ignored reality. He knew Goliath was dangerous. He knew the odds were bad. He knew the army was afraid for a reason. He won because he saw a greater reality. He understood that Goliath was not the biggest presence in that valley. God was. That changed everything. And there is another truth hidden here. David's real preparation for Goliath did not happen on the battlefield. It happened in obscurity, in the fields, in the waiting, in the quiet disciplines of shepherding, in the unglamorous responsibility of caring for sheep, in the lonely moments when he chose courage before anyone would ever praise him for it. So when the giant appeared, David was not suddenly transformed into a man of faith. He simply revealed the faith he had already been building in secret. That is why this story still speaks to us now. Because most of us know what it means to stand in a valley of fear. Maybe your giant is not a soldier 9 feet tall. Maybe it is failure. Maybe it is grief. Maybe it is poverty. Maybe it is rejection. Maybe it is a voice that has mocked you for so long that part of you has started believing it. Day after day, that giant stands at the edge of your peace and says, "You cannot win. You are too small. You are too late. You are not enough." And maybe like Israel, you have heard that voice for so long that fear has started feeling normal. But then comes the Spirit of David, the Spirit that says, "No, this does not get to define the field. This does not get the final word. This does not stand forever." David teaches us that courage is not the absence of fear. It is clarity in the presence of fear. It is knowing who you are, knowing what you carry, knowing what has already brought you this far, knowing that you do not need borrowed armor to fight the battles assigned to you. Some people lose before the battle starts because they spend all their time trying to fight like someone else. David refused that trap. He fought with the tools shaped by his own calling. A sling in another hand might have meant nothing. In David's hand, it became history. And maybe that is for someone listening right now. What if the thing you think is too small is exactly the thing placed in your hand for victory? What if your weakness is not your disqualification, but the stage on which God will show his strength? What if the years you thought were wasted in hidden places were actually training grounds for the moment that matters most? Because the Valley of Elah teaches us something unforgettable. The giant looked unbeatable until he fell. And when he fell, the world remembered not the size of his armor, but the name of the shepherd who trusted God. That is why David and Goliath remains one of the most powerful stories ever told. It is the story of a boy nobody expected, a king who was afraid, an army held hostage by shame, a giant who believed he was invincible, and a God who proved that one act of faith can overturn the logic of the world. The valley began with a question from Goliath, "Who will fight me?" But by the end, history was asking a different question. What can stop a person who knows that the battle belongs to the Lord? And perhaps that is the final heartbeat of this story. Not that David was fearless by nature, not that giants are illusions, not that battles are easy, but that sometimes heaven chooses the overlooked. Sometimes courage arrives in simple clothes. Sometimes victory walks in carrying lunch for someone else. And sometimes the person who changes the world is the one who shows up ready to be faithful. Everything is the one everyone assumed did not belong on the battlefield at all. So, remember the image. A valley between two hills. A giant wrapped in bronze. A boy with a sling. A stone cutting through the air. A nation holding its breath. And then the turning point. The giant falls. Fear breaks. Faith stands. And the story lives forever. Because in the end, David and Goliath is not just about the day a shepherd killed a giant. It is about what happens when faith steps forward while fear steps back. It is about what happens when someone refuses to measure life only by what the eye can see. It is about what happens when the weak become strong, not by power, not by appearance, but by trust in the living God. And that is why the story still matters. That is why people still tell it. And that is the complete story of David and Goliath.